there, and welcome to Family Politics. It's a show that's, well, brand new, and it's all about the matters that impact us all on a daily basis. I realised a while back that I had a very extended family with a huge number of different backgrounds and different ways of looking at the world. Under the umbrella of my family, I've got everything from a lorry driver right the way through to a consultant surgeon. So I think I'm really well placed to really get a feel for what's going on in the country. As part of my long-term plans, I've decided that I want to go down the route of looking into politics, becoming a member of Parliament. I'm not 100% sure yet that I am perfect for this role, but I got fed up of saying to myself, someone should do something a bit different. And I decided the best thing to do was to effectively put my money where my mouth is and run. So this is part of me trying to learn a little bit more about the issues that affect everyone and to help out as much as possible going forward. So I'm Ian Rexhawks, and this is my podcast. Now, it's called Family Politics. I decided that what would be quite interesting would be talking to members of my family and getting their views on certain subjects. And what better place to start than the person responsible for everything? It's my mum, Irene. So thanks very much for joining us, Mum. And can't quite believe that 40 years ago I came out of you.
Thanks for giving them my age, Ian. That's very kind.
Technically, I gave them my age.
Well, I mean, Ian has obviously been part of my life now for 40 years. It is an honour to see him progressing to the interests and encompassing life, which has dealt him quite a lot of hard blows in the past. And obviously, anything that I can do that will help him is in my power to do, as always.
That's very kind. I stress that this is not about just about me anyway.
No.
The conversation is definitely expected and intended to be a wider remit than just talking about sort of my political aspirations and indeed my medical history. But I thought it would be quite interesting to get your views on certain matters regarding your profession. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you did as a career?
Yeah, I was a GP working in various parts of the country for almost 40 years. I retired from general practice fully 5 years ago, although I did go back and do some voluntary work through COVID, both on the COVID hotline, NHS 111, and also by vaccinating for my old practice all the housebound patients to help out the practice. My feeling of general practice today is that I'm extremely glad that I'm not still working. I think that people's perception of general practice today is that it's inaccessible, unhelpful, and that they actually don't know how to get the information or the services that they require without incredible amount of hassle, either from receptionists, nurses that answer the phone, or just general day-to-day access to medical services. And it's not just, I mean, I'm lucky in that I've not needed to use emergency services through my general practice at all, but I hear stories from almost everyone about the difficulties in actually getting them to see the patients without an incredible amount of hassle. And that's something I'm ashamed of from my previous profession.
Yeah, and that's I remember obviously growing up, you put so much time into all of the stuff that's to do with the job that isn't necessarily actually seeing patients. I remember you spending a long time doing admin, a long time doing filing, all of that sort of stuff. Is that, do you think, the root cause of a lot of the woes, or is there something else that we can be talking about?
I think part of the problem is the lack of available people to actually do the work. When I went to medical school a long time ago, the ratio of male to female in my university year was about 80% male to 20% female. I know now that at medical schools there are more females practicing than males. And of course, because of being the childbearing species, there will be times when people have time off, both maternity leave and with childcare arrangements. So a lot of the people who train in medicine never work full time, or only work full time for a very short space of time. And I also think that a lot of the male doctors now see that they don't want to put in the hours to work the full time that we probably did in the past, because the days are so long and the demands of people and the profession generally have increased so much that they burn out. So a lot of them are going full-time, part-time. So although you're training more doctors, you're actually not getting any more hours. The population is increasing. The elderly population is increasing. We know that they take up proportionally much greater time than the younger generation. So there aren't the people to look after all the patients. And
so how competitive is it to get into medical school at the moment? How difficult is it to actually secure a place and get training, do you think?
I'm not sure that I actually know the answer to that one, Ian, because I don't know any of my generation whose children or grandchildren are applying for medical school. So I'm not...
Actually, that's understandable because it's such a huge commitment in terms of both the time that you spend learning and the cost.
Yeah.
I would imagine that a doctor leaves university now some, £60,000 or £70,000 in debt as a bare minimum just for the tuition fees.
Mm-hmm. One of the things and the cost of training a doctor is incredibly high. One of the things I always did think was wrong was that people could go through their medical school training and then not put in the hours afterwards to repay the cost of that training. Now, I don't know what.
So in some respects, your position is that actually what we ought to do is have some sort of covenant between a student doctor and the NHS or the government or the country or whatever you want to put it, and say, actually, we will subsidise your training to such a degree that we expect to see at least X number of years of I want to say loyalty, but that sounds almost like I don't think is a good thing. But yeah, I mean, conceptually, The only thing that I could see as a problem with that is that effectively it would be, holding a potential debt over someone's head and forcing them to do a job that perhaps they actually aren't that So, yeah, I think that's a really interesting one.
Certainly the ones that put in maybe a year or something and then decided to go to Australia or go to America and still practice their medicine, but not giving anything back to the NHS.
Yeah.
And I always felt
I can see why that would be a bit of a sore point. I guess the position that we're in at the moment is one where we could say, actually, so for someone in that position who spends a year working in the UK and then disappears off to America or Australia, they would never actually have to repay those student loans. So effectively they're in the same position that we almost talked about a moment ago, that someone should have their training fully subsidised by the country in exchange for staying, except that actually it's the reverse. They effectively get their training fully subsidised by the country if they leave and go somewhere else, which doesn't seem like a sensible way to do things. Economically, that just seems like it's encouraging the wrong behaviour.
Yeah. I don't know the answer.
No, but and that's the thing, is that this is not necessarily about finding answers. It's about identifying issues and exploring what the problem is. But I think, the biggest issue that we face is exactly what you've just described. That actually, fewer and fewer people want to be a doctor these days. And at least part of that is down to the fact that, the role of a junior doctor in particular is seen as really quite a poor choice. For someone who is academically gifted, they would be able to work considerably less and earn considerably more doing a huge number of other careers. Would you say that the role of doctor has basically been not demonized, but almost reduced in reputation and gravitas almost?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I don't think we want to go back to the old days where people were scared to come to their doctor or come to their GP because they they didn't know how they would be. The GP or the consultant wanted to be seen as God.
Yeah.
And we definitely don't want to go back to those days. However, I do think that in some cases it's gone a bit the other way, and the respect has gone. But whether that's partly because of the problems now of getting to see them and the presumption that they're actually sitting there twiddling their thumbs doing absolutely nothing because they're certainly not seeing patients. So it's a bit of a catch-22, really.
It's interesting because throughout all the times that I've spent dealing with the NHS, and as you know, that has been more than perhaps we would have liked. In all of that time, I have never seen a junior doctor that wasn't absolutely rushed off their feet in terms of the amount of work that they've had to do. I think, that you may be right. There may be this reputation that junior doctors aren't worth.
I think there's probably a big difference between people's perception of junior hospital doctors and general practitioners. Because most people...
the difference there?
Sorry?
What would you see as the difference there?
I think partly, most of the time when people are in hospitals, they are ill. and they can see that the amount of work that has to go into looking after them in hospital. But in general practice, a lot of people are not ill enough that they can see the value of what's being done, because they don't see it because it's a lot of it is admin or writing stuff up on the computer or whatever. Junior doctors are rushing around the hospital hither and thither. GPs are just sitting at a desk. They're not seen as being life-saving.
No, which is very frustrating, I imagine, from your side of things, because actually it's probably fair to say that you did save a number of lives during your career. Not just the direct involvement of resuscitating someone, but actually steering them in the right direction for treatment that they urgently needed.
Well, as a lot of people used to refer GPs as the gatekeepers of the NHS. Yeah, but
in a good way, though.
But unfortunately, the demands of people to access or want things done when they don't need anything done has increased. But because of the fear of litigation, which follows all of us around, then there is more work being done and referrals being done of people that actually don't need it. And the older I got and the more experienced I got, the more I knew the ones that needed referral and the ones that didn't.
Yeah.
But if you didn't refer somebody and you missed something, you were going to be castigated and,
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like a proper sort of catch-22. If you did the right thing and protected the NHS, then you could be accused of doing the wrong thing, and not giving the patient what they wanted. So even as little things as giving out antibiotics. A lot of the time, you knew that it was a viral infection. You knew that they didn't need antibiotics. But if you didn't give it to them, they'd just go to the next doctor, or they'd go to the next doctor. And eventually somebody would give in and say, but that was 3 appointments wasted. Yeah.
You hadn't given.
Of course, it's contributing to the overall antibiotic resistance that's building up over time. So
the same with painkillers, the same with anything like that. People, they just wanted a tablet to make them better.
Yeah.
And in general practice, you don't have the time to sit there and counsel people as to why they don't actually need. Well, you don't.
No.
Or didn't, certainly. Now, whether that has changed since COVID, certainly when you walk into a doctor's waiting room now, where in my day, the waiting room was never empty, now you never see more than a couple of people in it. Now, is that because they're not seeing anybody, or is it because people are not wanting to be seen? I don't know.
I presume it's because post-COVID, most or more GPs have switched over to telephone and video calls, which I think probably is definitely of mixed benefit. I think there's nothing that can ever really replace face-to-face interaction, but at the same time it probably saves an awful lot of cross infection and but I think that probably overall it's good to embrace that sort of technology.
So one of the other things which I think has causes an awful lot of problems is when they set up computer systems within hospitals and general practice, there's no one system where everybody can talk to each other. So even within my general practice, we were within Gloucestershire, Worcestershire, Warwickshire, everybody had different computer systems.
Ooh.
So you can't, a lot of time was spent on the telephone trying to phone up, get results. I think it has improved, but the hospital systems don't talk in the vast majority of times to GP systems.
No, and indeed, as you know, I'm dealing with a couple of different hospital trusts, and their systems are isolated from each other as well. So they can't share information across that boundary. So that's that strikes me as a major failing if we're talking about a single NHS that's looking after people from cradle to grave. It doesn't make a lot of sense for them to have different records at different institutions.
And there were billions of pounds spent many, many years ago, supposed to be setting up a health card that you carry, and it went nowhere. But the waste of money and resources at that time for a system that never worked.
So the concept is a good one. The idea of bringing in this overarching system. What do you think got in its way? What do you think stopped it from working?
Partly, I think it was that patients didn't trust it. They didn't trust that their information would be secure.
That's interesting. And when was that? Because that level of mistrust, I think probably, if we were talking about sort of late 90s, I would say, yeah, absolutely, 100%. If we're talking about now, then I would argue that it's gone completely the other direction. People are putting far too much information online. It would be interesting to know what sort of time frame are you talking about?
I think that probably was either 90s or early 2000s.
Okay, so it was, so the early 2000s would have been pretty much the heyday of the Labour government. And then it was 2010 when they switched over. So would it be fair to say then that they didn't have the momentum, pardon the pun, they didn't have the momentum to bring in a system during that time, and then when the Conservatives took over, they looked at the system and just went no and ended it, and that was the last you saw of a sort of unified system. Is that broadly what happened?
Well, there was the old fund holding thing as well, remember?
No, I don't remember.
They brought fund holding into general practice, so where now see, I'm pretty sure that was the Tories that brought it in, and basically what they did was hand the budget for all patient care to the GPs, which was a bit of a difficult one because none of us were trained in management and sorting out money and that. But where it did work was that you only paid the hospital for what they actually did.
Right.
And they had to provide information to say that they'd seen a patient or done an operation or somebody had not turned up, but you got charged anyway. It handed a lot more power to general practice. And it was working extremely well in a lot of places, but then I think it was the Labour government came in and scrapped it all.
Right.
And that's the trouble. There's been so much change, and the bodies that control trusts and general practice, as there's been so much change and so many name changes and so many administrative changes that it's like everything else. The money that's wasted just on changing headings on notepaper, and I think there is too much admin within the NHS.
Yeah.
Too many.
And it kind of sounds like there's two distinct problems, effectively, that we've talked about there. One is just under-resourcing of the NHS, so that's both people and technology. And the second is that there's too much interference in the NHS in terms of overarching sort of political entities that change whenever a major government change happens. So it kind of sounds like the way to approach the first is effectively to say, actually, do you know what? We need to fund the NHS properly. And that means, you know, potentially we all pay a little bit more in tax. And, you know, we know that the NHS is going to be there to look after us. And I think that, yeah, the idea of viewing the NHS as a profit centre or a place for efficiencies is wholly wrong, when we actually know it should be something that is a benefit to all of us. It's there if we need it. It's absolutely world-beating. That's my view of where the NHS should be, is that it should be top priority in terms of funding, and without question we should, you know, pay all the staff properly, and we should do what we need to do to attract as many people into it as we need to actually deal with everyone, and that's doctors right the way down to custodial staff. You know.
But I think as well as that, you have to have the backup of the social care side of it as well, because the NHS can't function as a standalone.
Yeah, absolutely. You end up with bed blocking because no one wants to release an elderly patient to an uncertain future. Yeah. And I think that's laudable. That's amazing to hear that the doctors and nurses are so concerned over their patients that they won't just discharge them. But at the same time, I imagine that they will get financially clobbered for what they choose to do, which is an awful situation. You know, that they should never be told off for doing something that's in the best interest of the patient.
Right.
So it comes to my second point, which is the interference from government, and I think part of the problem there, and this may lead to a wider talking point that we cover in another episode at some point. But basically, the system that we've got at the moment is one where the power is passed directly from usually from Conservative to Labour and back again over periodic times, and then that party wields absolute power for it's Frank back.
Yeah.
And then yes, that party wields absolute power for a number of years and then passes it back again. The system that I would favour is so this boils right down to electoral reform, and the position that I take is that actually it would make a lot more sense to reflect the wishes of society, the views of society better in Parliament. And that means we need to have some sort of proportionality to the voting system. The consequence of that is that it would be vanishingly unlikely for any party to ever have a majority again. So what that means is that no one party would have the ability to make sweeping changes. Instead, they would have to negotiate, they would have to compromise, they would have to look for a longer term than the one that they're in for. And as a result, I think what we would end up with is a much better system for looking after things like the NHS, because suddenly the NHS becomes this unifying policy for all parties. You know, there will be some fringe parties that want to get rid of it. That's fine. They should still be represented, but their voice will be drowned out by the number of people that say, actually, do you know what? We think the NHS is a national treasure and it should be kept well funded, and we should make sure that nothing can threaten it going forward. So I think that is the solution to the second part of what we talked about there.
Mm. Yeah, I do tend to agree that I think that it would be much better to have a consensus of people looking after the NHS as an autonomous organisation. Because, as you say, change costs. Every time there's change, it costs.
But I will go one further than that, and I will say, actually, what you've just described, a consensus of people looking after the NHS, that should be what government is all about.
Mm.
And in my view, that's actually the direction that we should be looking to go in, is consensus. We should be looking at discussion and compromise and negotiation and so on. We shouldn't be looking at this adversarial politics from the 16th century and thinking, yeah, this is definitely the way that the government should operate. It doesn't function correctly. There's an argument that it produces decisive leadership, but I think that has been absolutely blown to smithereens over the last 4 years. You know, they've had a significant majority, and the idea that this is decisive leadership is, well, laughable.
Mm. I think the trouble is that, that means going off the subject of the NHS, but I think the trouble is that people's perception of Parliament generally is that it's a bunch of schoolboys.
Yep.
Trying to tear strips off each other.
I absolutely agree, and I think that what I've talked about there, the adversarial setup, and this idea that you have the government and the opposition, is largely responsible for that level of backbiting, insulting, tearing each other apart, and so on. If we had a system where actually people's views were represented correctly at Parliament, I genuinely think that we would see much, much less of that. We would have a lot more talking, a lot more compromise, and a lot less posturing.
I agree. Just like it would be in a family, you know.
Well, that's nicely come full circle.
Yeah,
I didn't even prompt you for that. That's very nice.
People need to talk and they need to listen.
Yeah, I agree. I think it makes a lot of sense. Communication is just absolutely vital, and you know, differing views happen. They will. You know, you and I won't see eye to eye on absolutely everything.
No,
but we can still have a productive and useful conversation, and we don't talk about. You know, we've covered off a lot of topics today. At no point have we discussed any particular political parties apart from the Conservatives being mentioned a couple of times. But we haven't disparaged anyone's views. We haven't said this is the correct party to vote for or anything like that. What we've done is hopefully been quite productive and
informative.
Quite a conversation. So, any sort of closing comments on the NHS?
I think we just need to get back to being a caring profession from the top down, And I think due to lack of funding, due to COVID, due to Brexit, I'm sorry to say it, we have lost a lot of the people who were the caregivers. And until we can actually get those numbers back, pay them properly, I think almost you need to start from the bottom up rather than thinking about the top down.
I think that's a really wonderful sentiment, and I think it's it really does. It espouses everything that I would believe in. I think that the NHS it does need to be nurtured. It needs to be looked after, and ultimately, we're in a very fortunate position, you and I, that actually, if we have to pay a bit more in tax, we're not going to be left or anything like that. That's that's a really fundamentally very strong position to be in, and it is a little bit upsetting to see where people who are considerably richer than you or I, who are doing absolutely everything that they possibly can to not pay tax. Talking about estates worth hundreds of millions of pounds passing without any form of inheritance tax.
Doesn't sit comfortably.
It doesn't, no. Especially when we're talking about problems with the fundamental, the NHS, one of the basic human rights, healthcare. If we don't have enough money to fund that in a society that's collectively worth some 14 trillion pounds, there's something wrong with us.
Yes, absolutely.
Well,
okay.
Yes, on that note, I think we draw this to a close.
Yep.
So I would just like to say thank you very much, Mum. That has been a really fantastic conversation. I very much enjoyed talking about, your lived experience. I would also just like to thank a couple of people, and you might want to close your ears for this one. I need to thank Dad because he provided the theme tune for the show, and I need to thank my brother James because he's doing the video editing. So thank you both. If you have enjoyed this, then like, subscribe, whatever is an option on the service that you're using, and tune in for another episode in future where I'll pick the brains of someone else related to me about something else. See where we go. Thanks again, Mum.
Thank you, Ian.
All right. Bye-bye.